it's Miss A. Today we are going to be reading Heart and Soul, the story of America and African Americans by Kadir Nelson. I know you guys have probably seen this book in our classroom. I have numerous copies. Joining us today is William. Peep in and say hello. Is William. Scoot over, they can't see you. Okay, so I'm going to start with chapter 1, and this is a history of America based on the founding of America. It's also based in an African American perspective. It's written by Black people for Black people to understand our history and where we've come from. The nice thing is this has different people telling their point of view in this story. So be careful to watch whose point of view, and I'll be careful to tell you whose point of view this is coming from. All right, so this is the prologue, and here is the picture of the young lady. We assume this is her point of view. My age and complexion don't speak much about the past. Sometimes it's just too hard to talk about. Nothing we like to share with you young folk. No parent wants to tell a child that he was once a slave and made to do another man's bidding, or that she had to swallow her pride and take what she was given. Even though she knew it wasn't fair, our story is chock full of things like this, things that might make you cringe or feel angry, but there are also parts that will make you feel proud or even laugh a little. You gotta take the good with the bad, I guess. You have to know where you come from so you can know where to move forward. Many of us are getting up in age and feel it's time to make some things known before they are gone for good. So it's important that you pay attention, honey, because I'm only going to tell you the story but once. Hey, there's chips and these things, like maybe find a different place to eat these because that's distracting. Sorry. Chapter 1, Declarations of Independence. Liberty, when it begins to take root, is a plant of rapid growth. George Washington. Ever visit the Capitol in Washington, D.C.? It's a beautiful white building made of sandstone, and it has a big iron dome that rises over the city like a full moon. It was built by slaves and freemen to be a symbol of the liberty Americans had won from England in the American Revolution. Inside the rotunda, there are large paintings and sculptures of famous Americans, big old statues of Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. The paintings tell the story of how America came to be. Strange though, nary a black face in all of those pretty pictures. There's plenty of white folks and a few Indians here and there, but none of us. It's as if we didn't exist, stricken from the record, like Moses from the walls of Egypt. Of course, those fancy paintings ain't telling the whole truth. Black folk have been here at least as long as Europeans. And by the early 1600s, English, Spanish, and Portuguese, Dutch, and French settlers had made their way to America and established colonies all along the East Coast. The colonies were a means for European countries to expand their empires and were also a new source of wealth. Each colony produced crops and mined for riches that were sent back to Europe. Africans had come to America as laborers with the Spanish. So this is coming from a point of view. It's a midline. We know that it's the narrator's point of view. In Florida in 1565, about 60 years later, with the English in Virginia to do the work of the building of the colonies, producing what was sent back to Europe. The labor of these Africans helped to create the foundation of America in its early days. So you see, we deserve to be in those pictures just as much as any Europeans and Indians. And if you really want to know the truth, honey, we are very much the reason they would later have a chance. To fight for their liberty in the first place. By the mid-1700s, the English colonists had been in America for a few generations. They had gained control of most of the settled land along the eastern seaboard, set up local governments, and made colonies quite profitable by way of slave-produced crops. Having been in America for so long, many of the colonists began to think of themselves as Americans. rather than British, and had grown good and tired of living under the thumb of a faraway king. The colonists felt that it was time that they had a say about how things were ran with their local governments. They began to talk on the streets, over dinner tables, and in taverns about the king's unfair taxes and about his nosy soldiers, and about splitting from England. They talked about not wanting to be slaves to the king. Slaves? Child, what in the world would they ever know about that? The king had taxed the colonists for everything from paint to glass and paper. He even taxed their tea. People in the colonies had had enough. To show the king what they thought of his taxes, they snuck out to the boats and dumped all of his tea into the harbor. It wasn't long until the king sent more troops over here to try to put folks in the colonies back in their place. But it only made relations worse, and the colonists more determined than ever to split with England. In 2 years, there was blood on the streets of Boston, and in one more, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence to cut ties with England. The American Revolution had begun. There were slaves who fought in that war, but unfortunately, many of them chose the wrong side. By the time of the Revolutionary War, there was more than 450,000 black folks, both slaves and frees, in colonies. The British had promised freedom to any slave who fought for them. And honey, that was a powerful thing to tell a slave. So thousands of them joined the British. General George Washington, who was in charge of the American troops, didn't allow black folks to fight in his army. He and the Congress didn't think it was a good idea to put guns in the hands of people who might well use them against their former masters or other white folks. He changed his mind after he'd lost many of his soldiers to fighting and the pox. Only then were free black folks and some slaves allowed to join his army. General Washington was quickly rewarded by all the black men who signed up to help him gain the upper hand. After 8 years of war, America won its freedom from England, and the citizens were able to manage their own affairs and control their property without having to pay the crown for the privilege. Oh, did I mention their property included us? Both the slaves and free black folk who fought in this war for freedom hoped that the government might free all the slaves in the colonies if they fought for them. But the government only freed the folks who had fought in the army and the slaves who lived in New England states like Massachusetts that chose to abolish slavery after the war. Just about everybody else was out of luck, especially many of the slaves who fought for the British. Some left with the British or fled to Canada, but most went right back into slavery. A few years later, America wrote her founding papers, the Constitution. George Washington was made the very first president and a new country was born. Should have been a proud moment for everybody, but honey, we didn't have much of a reason to celebrate. Through the fruits of our labor and our volunteer soldiers, we had helped set America free from England, and yet we were stuck in a country that kept most of us as slaves. Chapter 1, I'd like to know your thoughts. So I'm going to say his thoughts surrounding it. Here's some things I want you guys to think about. Is the founding of America, where did it come from? How did America come to be? I read that in the beginning of the chapter. I also want you guys to think about what they meant when they said in this last part, we had helped America free from England, and yet we were stuck in a country that kept most of us as slaves. Now, the American Revolution was before the Civil Rights Movement. It was also prior to any type of civil war. So we're talking about a time, let's see what year we're looking at in the American Revolution. We're talking prior to slavery being ended. So at this point, right before the American Revolution, they had already taken slaves and they were already brought to the U.S. Some of us were already here. Black people were already here, but they were also enslaved when the British landed here from England. So they were already taken and enslaved. Even if you were a black person and you did not come from Africa, like if you were here, you were basically African. They did not care. So this is at the point explaining when the Americans had brought over the slaves and had started enslaving them. So chapter 1's enclosing how America actually was founded and came to be. Chapter 2 that we'll cover next week, that I'll be reading and publishing on this YouTube channel next week. Chapter 2 will be slavery. So that will cover what slavery looked like. And this is from this is from a previous slave's perspective. His name is Young Pap. I can't wait to share it with you guys.